Greetings, listeners. Welcome back to Spooky Stories with Dated. I am so glad that you were able to join me again tonight. I have a particularly good story for you all. This story, once again, might be true. I'll let you decide that for yourself. Anyways, here it is. I was born and raised in a very small town of perhaps 500 people. When surrounded by the near endless forest, it can feel as though you are isolated from the rest of the outside world. There are many old sayings in my hometown, bits of advice passed down through the generations to act as cautionary tales against dangers both real and imagined. One warning, in particular, affected me deeply when I was a child. My grandmother would often say, "If you are standing in the shade of an old tree, don't look up. A stranger's face may look back down at you. The stranger may be an angel, or it may be a devil. Don't look up. Just say a prayer so that the devils keep away and the angels watch over you." While this seemed like just another one of the countless tales told just to make kids say their prayers, this story planted within me a deep subconscious aversion to looking up while under trees. I'm not sure that I would have been able to look up while beneath a great old pine, no matter how hard I tried. It's strange how impressionable the young mind of a child can be. There were more than a few tales that left that sort of impression on me. To be honest, the majority of these cautionary tales seemed to skirt the border between creative and terrifying a little too closely. As I became older, however, I forgot the specifics of most of these, and these subconscious fears gradually faded away. Despite this, I never did look up while under a large tree until about a year ago. I had a close friend in that small town. His name was Lewis. I use past tense here because he passed away just over a year ago. I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say that he was my best friend, but in a town that small, everyone you spend time with leaves a strong impression. While we certainly spent more time together as children, we had stayed in touch and still hung out from time to time, right up until the end. I hadn't realized just how much of a role he had played in my life until after he was gone. He washed ashore in a local creek approximately 1 week after he was reported missing. There was no evidence of foul play, but nobody knows why he went missing or how he ended up in a creek to begin with. It was a hot, sunny day on the afternoon of Lewis's funeral. The entire summer had been a sort of cloudless fever dream, with sun so bright that you could hardly keep your eyes open, and cicadas buzzing so loudly that you couldn't hear your own thoughts. That afternoon was no different, and our only respite from the beating sun was the shade cast by the old oak tree in the cemetery. As the pastor fought against the screaming cicadas for our strained attention, his words seemed to fuse together with the relentless buzzing. It was as my focus drifted away from his speech that I forgot about the fear which had always kept my eyes pointed firmly downwards. As my head rolled back, my gaze was met with another. There were a pair of eyes staring intensely down at me from among the dark, tangled branches. I froze in disbelief as the shadowed face with piercing human eyes stared down at me. As I stared back at the face in the branches, I realized that the old story had been wrong. This was not the face of a stranger, but undeniably it was the face of my former friend, Lewis. It was as the mouth began to gape slowly open and the first crack of sound came out that my vision faded completely. Heath Stroke. When I came to in the hospital, no one seemed surprised by my recollection of the events leading up to the stroke. After all, hallucination is par for the course when passing out from heat exhaustion. My assertion that it was Lewis's face specifically that I had seen at none other than Lewis's own funeral simply painted a picture of grief and mourning and elicited the sort of concern that caused me to stop talking about it altogether. That's not to say that I was completely unfazed by his passing, but I was certainly not affected to the extent of delusion. Subconscious fear is a fascinating thing. When the warning was nothing more than a story, the fear was paralyzing, and to look up while beneath a tree seemed impossible for me. However, now that I felt that I had truly seen something, this deep fear caused in me an opposite effect. While I was terrified still, I had an itching compulsion to look beneath the branches now. Before, the only risk was that my fears would be confirmed, but now that I had possibly seen what I feared, I had a craving to disprove it by doing what I knew I shouldn't. It hadn't seemed possible, but the summer that year had grown hotter and the cicadas louder. It was hard to find the motivation to go outside in those conditions, yet my summer job as an assistant park ranger had me out in the blinding sun on a near daily basis, mostly just doing the rounds. Given the unbearable climate, the shade of the trees in the park was the only barrier between myself and another embarrassing medical incident. I had no real training in any relevant field and no aspiration to become a park ranger or similar, but the idea of spending my summer between the college semesters outdoors seemed like a good idea at the time. In hindsight, this was not the correct decision. It was on one particularly bright Wednesday afternoon that the victor of my aforementioned internal struggle was decided. A moment came where the already burning sunlight seemed to intensify further, as if non-existent clouds had parted and allowed a previously inconceivable amount of sunlight through. Seeking shelter from the pounding heat, I ducked beneath a large spruce tree which stood largely alone in an open, well-kept field. The relief of the shade was short-lived, as my new proximity to the source of the screaming cicadas quickly became apparent. As I stared out into the now pitch-white, fluttering landscape around me, I could only focus more intensely on the sound of the cicadas, seemingly growing louder as I involuntarily listened more closely. Now lost in the bitter hum of the hidden insects, I began to hear what seemed to be words forming from the steady screeching. The more I listened, the more familiar the voice and the buzzing became, and it was then that my gaze was drawn upwards once more, towards the dark, tangled branches. Lewis looked back down at me again, but it was not the Lewis now that I had seen before. This Lewis was a pale gray, and his features were swollen. His face seemed to be incorporated into the branches to some degree, and his features puffed out unnaturally. His mouth opened as it had before, only now it was evident that the sound which came out was formed by the distorted cacophony of the tree-dwelling insects. Who are you? Let go of me. The next memory I have after hearing those words is that of waking up beneath the old spruce tree, as if from a casual summer nap. There were only gnarled branches facing down at me when my eyes opened, without any sign of Lewis in that dark, tangled mess. The sun had returned to its usual intensity, and the cicadas buzzed at their usual volume. I'm not quite sure what those words had meant exactly, but given the mysterious circumstances surrounding Lewis's final days, I can't help but feel as though the face in the trees might yet have a disturbing story to tell. I dread to imagine what the face of my late friend will look like the next time it presents itself. Well, there you have it, listeners. Another beautiful, cautionary tale. I'm sure there's a lesson in here that we can all take away and use to better our own lives. True or false? Well, that's up to you. Thank you for joining me once again.